Good morning here in Venice and Culver City, where Matt has joined me on Zoom, and we are going to have our third conversation this morning. We speak in between these conversations and consider some of the things we're discussing and think about ways we can focus our thoughts and energy and conversation, and then end up having it go exactly where it goes, where no man has gone before, in the sense that we're doing what we're doing as we're doing it and speaking to things as we find them, think of them. And I appreciated, Matt, our second conversation. I listened to it a couple of times, and as you know, I sent you some thoughts about that. So anyway, welcome.
Thanks, Jack. Good morning. And it's good to be back with you.
Thank you. Always. I appreciate it. The purpose of this discussion is to really show that we don't have to be ready to abandon any of the thoughts that we normally rely on, or any of the tendencies or behaviors or things that we do, to simply consider things from another point of view. It isn't mandatory that we fight for the things we normally do. It's an option. And it doesn't threaten those things. If we want to do them, we're perfectly welcome to continue to do those things. But if those things are harming us in ways that we don't even notice, and or we notice them and think of them as things that are happening to us rather than being caused by us, it shows how this obsessive thinking can turn into a hypnotic trance, imagining all kinds of threats justifying that thinking. And when our thinking is the greatest threat, we are living with that threat 24 hours a day. So our conversation is not to dismiss those things or to change those things or to fight those things or demand that those things not be done in anyone's thinking, but to simply notice that if they are happening, there's a good chance that if we can make them up, we can unmake them. And I would say there's a better than good chance, because if we're making them up and living in what feels like a depressing hell of any sort, or just simply living with a mild sense of anxiety and stress, if those things are coming as a result of thinking that we're doing, if we can do it, we can certainly undo it. And that's the premise of this conversation. This isn't a medical approach or any kind of academic prescription. It's simply a conversation to allow thoughts to continue, to allow thoughts to consider ideas that go beyond the limits of what we might call normalcy and convention.
Yeah, I like that a lot. We can undo. Would you use the word deconstruct in any way?
Well, I think that leads to the question I wanted to ask today. And things are either real or they're imagined. So real things don't need to be thought of, and imagined things only exist as long as they're thought of.
Right.
So if I'm imagining my thoughts are true and real, I have to think about those thoughts, literally have to. Now I am compelled to maintain that belief by thinking about them all the time. And if what I'm thinking about isn't true, it has no substance, it's delusional. So effectively, the only thing I'm doing is thinking about them with a thought right now that there's something to think about that has no basis.
Yeah, it's like,
you follow that?
Yeah, I do. And if for me, it becomes a practice. I could wake up and say, "Oh, what were those thoughts I need to have today?" I have to remember what I was thinking the day before, even if they're not positive thoughts or productive thoughts.
I mean, you have to remember the worry to get back to it when you wake up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have to gather up my stress and anxiety. So I could set off on my day the way I did the day before, the way I know.
And in effect, our ego is based on that identification because it becomes who we think we are. When we in imagination believe our thinking is real and true, we become the creators of reality. So who do we become but those thoughts? So ego then is based on those thoughts, which if they're not true is grandiose. To give them so much credit is to imagine they even have a life. And to then imagine that they could die and that our life is dependent on protecting those thoughts is the fear of death. My clearer experience is that I haven't been afraid of death, since that's going to happen as it's designed to happen. And by the way, people strive for perfection throughout life. And the one thing we can be pretty sure of, that I know that everyone who's done so far has done very well, is to die.
Yeah, it's the only reliable result I guess we all share.
Even it used to be death and taxes, and even taxes now are somewhat questionable given the ability to avoid the tax code. So
Yeah.
the point is that if the only thing I'm thinking I am are the thoughts I have, my real fear of death is not in the future when my body dies, which is a natural process that everyone does in a relatively beautiful way, if it isn't accidental or violent. That process tends to be, if you listen to people and watch and witness people who go through it, tends to be a real reckoning and an opening and insightful and an awakening of sorts, probably an awakening to the thing that's already existed, always existed, that our preoccupation of obsessive, fearful thinking has given us the impression doesn't exist, but it's only an impression of an imposter, and that imposter is the ego of who I think I am. So what I'm afraid of in death is literally letting go of the thought presently of who I think I am. Not actually who I am, because if there is an absolute basis for existence, the basis of our existence collectively isn't in question, and it isn't in doubt, and it doesn't have a beginning or an end, and it's always simply present wherever we are in our human experience. Because our body registers that presence, our body knows that presence, our body is born of that presence, our body is effectively that presence, whatever that gift is, whatever that thing is, whatever that present is that we were given is the present of the awareness we have wherever we are. And in human terms, we're always in the present. There's nothing that ever happens at any other time than the present. So the real question is, not how do we let go of this thing we're doing, but how do we begin to address how seriously we take it to consider that it's absolutely something we can't let go of?
Right. So how do you do that?
Well, my sense is, here's what happens when I have a thought that's not true. I start thinking the consequences that occur are happening to me rather than by me. I go into a hypnotic trance that what I'm doing has nothing to do with the effect I'm creating, so I make believe it's happening to me so I can become a victim. And I would suggest there are no victims in an absolute state of being. None. It's not possible.
Do you have an
Because
example?
How could you be given everything and be a victim to anything? There are no bits and pieces to attack or to defend or to fight over or to claim. There's not any more or less in an infinite state of being. It's just a state of absolute being. It's a state of absolute knowing. It isn't a state of thinking. It isn't a state of process. It's an absolute state of being. And if that absolute state of being is absolute, it must be absolutely where we are, wherever we are. And it isn't even there in those terms, because it wouldn't be something operating in time and space. We would simply be translating it from a body born in time and space to manage and experience time and space. Our bodies are designed to function in this relative field of experience that we're experiencing. Our eyes don't see what's there. What's there are seen by our eyes, particular to the way our eyes are designed. Snakes see heat. They don't see the forms that we see. They know when they see heat, it's edible, and they go find it. They know they're onto something. That's their job, is to eat and survive. So how our body translates things isn't how things are, it's how our body translates them. Our senses, Our senses give us raw data, and then we think about what that data means to us.
Yeah,
And
it's like a filter.
if my thinking is corrupt, I'm going to misuse the information and think that wrong is right and right is wrong, and all of a sudden wonder why I'm in conflict and emotional turmoil. It's just a misapplication of what's happening. So whenever I misapply, it's like in the math conversation we were having, whenever I misapply the principles, I'm going to have problems, and things are going to seem incredibly complex, and problems are going to seem really difficult to solve. And it's probably not a surprise in society that we have a war on those things. We have a war on poverty because it's hard to understand. When it isn't actually hard to understand, it's simply hard to understand when you decide you need to fight it with a war to fix it. That's the problem. We have a war on drugs. Drugs are cheaper and more plentiful than they have been since that war started in 1972 or 3. You know, I'm ashamed to have done coke when it was the most expensive and the worst quality possible.
That was bad timing.
Now you could buy it for a lot less, and nobody bothers to cut it. There's containerfuls coming into the country since the war on drugs started. So lives tend to support the contention of the thinker that seems to be living. And if my life is dependent on the corrupt thinking I'm doing, I'm going to find corruption to support the contention that I'm right in the thinking I'm doing, because survival depends on being right. So when wrong becomes right, that's a pretty major conflict in thought. And I'm going to probably face a lot of consequences that are wrong that I'm going to blame on other people and act as though I'm a victim to, rather than begin to say, I am creating this as a chance to offer myself perspective to what I'm thinking so I can see what I'm unwilling to admit I'm doing with some distance. I'm putting it outside of me, just like a compulsion is something I focus on outside of me to try to escape the thing I'm doing within me.
Can you do you have any examples of, your process for handling that and redirecting your thoughts so you're not a victim?
Well, to begin to realize that in any absolute sense, responsibility can never be any less than responsible. If I begin to look at things principally in terms of the premise of life, for instance, if life is life, it certainly doesn't include death. So what we have isn't actually life. We have life forms that are possibilities of life. Life doesn't change when I die or you die in terms of a body. We actually fulfill the nature of that story that our bodies are telling, the arc, beginning, middle, and end. We're fulfilling that. And if I'm looking accurately at what's happening, I'm calling it according to what it is rather than what I think it is, and start seeing that we are life forms. We are projections of possibility within a realm of possibility, which would be the entire universe. And the universe, as I understand it, if they claim it's constantly expanding, would mean where it is right now is limited. So to think of the universe as infinite would have to include something that doesn't have limits. So the universe itself couldn't be that thing. The universe is just another thing within that realm of possibility. It's kind of like forever. If forever never comes, you can wait forever for forever and it never comes. That's torture. If we're waiting forever to get somewhere, that's torture. If we're already in the place we think we have to go, that's not torture at all. That's an infinite gift.
I was thinking about as a child how I was just conditioned culturally, my upbringing, anticipating things like Christmas. There'll be some happiness when that day comes. You're going to get all these gifts. Waiting to be tall enough so I can ride the roller coaster. Things are going to be better. And then it just goes on. I can't wait to be out of school. I can't wait to be of age so I can drink. It's like, so you start that at such a young age. And it's just inherent in the way I think. It's deep in there, and it started a long time ago.
So to your question last week, how do we get this to the kids? My sense
Yeah,
is the kids are wondering why we don't get this.
yeah, maybe.
Because before they start assimilating the things that they're hearing around them that cause the conflicts they struggle with, there's a sense of clarity in kids because they haven't been thinking about anything. They've just been witnessing it from a very raw state of awareness. And yet, even in that awareness, kids know exactly when to cry because they want something. Something's wrong, they cry out. It isn't developed language, but it's language of an infant.
Right.
So they're very clear. And there was some, I think Sturgis was talking the other day about the theta state of kids up until about 7 years old, where they start having the rational construct that they begin formulating the ideas that they begin to think are their truth, and then start having the same conflicts that they're finding, which is when the conflicts with parents often begin. Because now it's thought against thought and idea against idea. And by adolescence, kids generally realize our parents are not God. They are not infinitely endowed with a bit of information that is uncontestable. And so kids start fighting. Now, that's a pretty broad generalization, and I think there's a lot of variations in there, but it's a pretty consistent pattern in terms of kids growing up in a rational structure, which may not be rational.
I can relate that to, I've heard that same age to 7, where you take on the financial situation of your family. And for my family, it rings true. My oldest sister is probably the most financially successful. And when she was 7, my parents were doing well financially. I'll just call her I have 3 older sisters. So the next one in age, situation changed by the time she was 7. There's a direct correlation to that theory to my own family when it comes to finances anyway.
So when you're saying when you take that on, you mean that became your baseline, like your culture?
Yeah.
So you assimilated that as being the standard of how economics work in the world.
The way I perceive it, the way I think about it.
Yes.
Well, by the time it was presented to me, experiencing that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And
then I would say that's what you're thinking.
Yeah. I'm trying to think my way out of it. But,
exactly. Well, so here to the original question is, how do we get out of it, is to think that we're in it. So if we're strategizing on how to get out of it, and we keep strategizing from thinking we're in it, and we're really not in it except to the delusional thought we're in it, the building block we're using is the same one you used at 7 to determine that this is how finances are and this is how it'll always be, because you thought your thought was true and real. And for the most part, in my experience, I was very desperate as a kid to come to the right conclusion so that I could stop getting into trouble. But yet most of what I did was to get in more and more trouble so I could simply get used to being in trouble rather than think it was ever going to stop. Because I was so baffled by everything, all the rules and the regulations and the authorities that you have to do this, you have to sit up, you can't talk with your mouth full. And I'm like, all this stuff just was frustrating to me and didn't seem legitimate enough to adhere to as anything other than behavioral modification. Just like a dog started finally conceding, if I'm going to get fed around here, I got to go outside to shit and piss.
Yeah.
So it's taming that inner exploration or that inner capacity to explore. And then as it's being young, I think the greatest impressions on us are made. But then to grow up and call ourselves mature by continuing to maintain those impressions is not really maturing. It's refining something that really didn't work when we chose it, and forgetting that we chose it at 7 and saying, okay, well, that may have been perfect for 7. I'm not sure it's perfect for 70.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And just realizing that we have continued to batter ourselves with ideas, batter both in the idea that we're like getting to be fried we're using a batter to actually prepare ourselves for the frying pan, or we're beating ourselves into a submission that eventually I'll get this right if I keep applying the wrong basis.
I know of parents that do. I don't know what the approach is. I don't know what it's called, but there is an approach where you just let your kids go. You discipline them as little as possible. And have you heard of this, or do you know
Well,
of this approach? And they're not fun kids to be around.
In the Hebrew Orthodox tradition, you don't put any controls on kids until at least 5. You just let them go. And I knew a rabbi in Los Angeles here who had 13 kids, and I went over to have a meeting there, and it was absolute mayhem, but there was a certain order to it that was actually, it wasn't as out of order as it could have been because it was their natural order. But there was a lot going on in that house.
Yeah, that's a struggle for me because I agree with you there. I could see that as a perfect order.
Well, it would probably help develop ideas about the individual that would be built in confidence rather than in doubt. But it doesn't subject us to continuing to maintain the doubtful ideas well into adulthood without finally conceding that clearly there's something I'm thinking that's wrong. And the whole idea of thinking something in thought is so true and real is to create a degree of permanence, this chronic maintenance of doing it over and over and over again, habitually and addictively, thinking someday it'll get better, is such an obvious, glaring consequence for the thinking. And yet we continue. And my experience in addiction is addiction's a lie. And as a result, the actions we take are further lying because the seed is a lie, the tree is going to be a lie. The seed's an oak, doesn't matter how small it is, it's going to be an oak tree. If it's allowed to grow, it's going to be huge. It all came from that seed. The messes we make are indications of the thinking we're doing. And if we don't start simply stopping, and my sense is this isn't often easy to do alone because isolation tends to allow us to fester more and more and more thoughts born in isolation because they have no basis and seem to be more true because we rely on the feelings we have, which is anxiety, stress, and fear, and then become phobic and think being alone is necessary because now we fear everything and everyone and can't get near them because they're going to cause a bigger problem when in fact the problem being caused is our own generated anxiety and stress. So communication is a bridge. Talking about it openly is a bridge. The whole point of this podcast is to have an accurate conversation, as accurate as possible. I don't say I do that. I just have been harping on this longer than anybody I know. So I continue. And the continuation is simply a chance to open up. And my experience, like with you in our last conversation, is I learn an enormous amount from interacting with people. Because if we share the same basis, we're offering each other the same totality that we already have, and often not seeing in the individuation of ideas that we maintain that aren't true. And as light shines, darkness always goes away.
I do it all the time. When I get into any type of depression, solitude and isolation is that's the most comfortable place I can be. I know I'll feel better if I call someone or just go out, just leave my apartment. But
you see,
why does it take me so long to do it? Because it always takes me longer than I feel like it should. This is years, and I'm observing myself while I'm in it.
Yeah,
but it's still hard to make that call.
My sense is we haven't been talking about it honestly, so we really believe someday if we nurse it longer, it'll happen and be true. And I think part of this too, Matt, is to admit those superficial thoughts, the ones that we're thinking that have words attached to them in our brain, which we generally call our consciousness. We don't think we're conscious of anything other than that conversation that we're having, right?
Yeah.
We think that's subconscious. Well, if we can talk about a subconscious, we're conscious of the subconscious. And if we think the things we think are hidden there are, if we think the things that are there are hidden and we put those things there, we are using that as an excuse to deny what's happening once more and again think what's happening is happening to us rather than being created by us. So my windfall in relation to that was to begin to simply admit that the motivation for the thoughts I'm having that are isolated are thoughts I'm thinking that I don't think I'm thinking. And that simple concession began to allow me to see that there was this subterranean darkness where I kept things and thought I could hide them. And that's where it became obvious to me that nothing is hidden anywhere in the universe. Everything is doing exactly what it's doing. And the nature of depression and anxiety and stress is the revelation of this idea that I can hide anything. Why? It's a lie. So what does it do? It appears in anxiety and stress and depression, because the immediacy of it has a consequence that reveals it. Because if I think I can keep a secret and lie, the lie immediately reveals itself in struggles and stress. And the idea that it's secret becomes obvious because I'm suffering. So the reality of it, in terms that would be accurate, I suspect, is that nothing's ever hidden. It's always secreting through us. The secrets secrete through our pores, our nervousness, our sense of shyness, the guilt and shame that you're just identifying. My experience, I have been embarrassed to be doing what I've been doing so long, is to think it's normal and natural. And I've developed personal traits that try to laugh it off and act as though it's not there, which is just a furtherance of the denial rather than simply admit, I do some very weak-seated things. I rely on thoughts that aren't true. I am reactive and irritable on the basis of those thoughts. And now I look at the consequence as a guidance system for what I'm doing, rather than as something to try to escape doing and leap over the point that I'm creating it in my thinking and then trying to escape the consequence of it by acting compulsively and thinking that the short-term gain of the immediacy of denial is going to somehow win the war, when it's never won yet and it never will win.
Yeah. You're saying that, I think of what I hear in meetings all the time. I'm sure you've heard it, that we're only as sick as our secrets.
But the sick part is thinking we can keep them. And not simply admitting, to your question earlier, how do we let go of it? When we start seeing things accurately, you realize you never hung on to anything. We have been held not even in the grasp of an infinite source, but in the presence of an absolute source is our nature. We can't even escape it if we tried. There's no way. You can't escape something infinite, or it wouldn't be infinite. And I don't say that as a spiritual, religious, theological, philosophical point, but simply saying if something's infinite, it's infinite, and there would be no way to have any less than it or any more of it, because it isn't functioning in spatial dimensional terms. It's just a presence. It just is what it is. And if it is, I would suggest we all know it. We just don't express it, and we're ashamed and pitiful about our lack of willingness to simply express all that we already know. So what do? Go on quests, seek paths, journeys, looking for it as though it's somewhere else. That would be the claim that it isn't here. If it isn't here, it isn't infinite. And if we were doomed by nature, it wouldn't scare us. We would simply concede it naturally and say, so what? If I wasn't here, I wouldn't be doomed. Isn't that the same, saying the same thing as thinking we shouldn't die? We're claiming the only way to avoid the doom is not being here, and then talk about being afraid to die. It should seem like a relief if that were the case.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't add up. It's irrational. The irony of it starts to reckon with the fact that what we're doing that we think is practical and real makes the abstract nature of an infinite source or something beyond our intelligence, beyond the mental intelligence we may have, and it isn't even beyond it because it's within it, beyond our capacity to even consider it, seem impractical, when in fact that's the greatest practicality, and the impracticality is me thinking that somehow my limited thoughts supersede it. That's the craziness. So if you're looking at it accurately, there's nothing to let go of. And when you see that, you realize the one thing we've been seeking is the one thing that we've always had. Because it isn't one thing, it's something we all have. It's something that is everywhere. It's with everything and everyone throughout the entire universe and whatever would be considered beyond the limits of the universe. So it is both within and without. Things that seem contrary, things that seem paradoxical, things that seem impossible, but in the nature of something absolute, that's the nature of it.
It's deep.
Probably not.
Wow.
My sense is what we've buried is deep, and what you're beginning to see when you even consider that is the depth of the things you think you've kept at a distance that are immediately affecting you. And we use those terms because in spatial terms, it gives us a sense of being apart from it, which is exactly what compulsions do. So my sense with, and this took me some time to look at, and I think it's accurate. I mean, may be wrong in all of this. This may all just be complete nonsense. But I would suggest that as I talk about it and people concede little bits, they have an experience that suggests otherwise, that's clarifying, that all of a sudden doesn't have them see that they came any distance, but they all of a sudden look back and say, boy, I don't seem to be doing that thing I used to do all the time. And I'm not thinking, I'm laughing now rather than crying. I'm not pitiful. I'm actually feeling the buoyancy of my experience in relation to that thing I used to do so consistently that now I see as just a joke, like a silly gesture.
I notice that in meetings all the time where, whoever's sharing or leading the meeting we can laugh together as a group at what used to cause pain.
Well, and a lot of times the people who are still witnessing the pain don't understand the laughter because they're taking it so seriously. They're looking for somebody to help support their contention. It's true and real. And when everybody laughs, they're bewildered.
Yeah. Sometimes they're the first ones to laugh.
No, I got it. It goes every possible way.
Yeah.
So the point I was getting to in the absolute is that it can't be deep if it's always available. So it must be superficial and immediate and spontaneous and accessible always. So there is no depth to it at all. When we say truth is deep, it's because we've buried ideas that we think are true into our body where we're suffering pain and numbness and desensitization and disease in the maintenance of those things, claiming they're true and wondering why we're afraid when we're causing our own ill health and social ills.
The hole we've dug is deep. That's what I meant.
Yes, that's good. And when you think of that, if there's no substance, it's just an idea that there's something there that's substantive, and that would take, you would have to be infinitely correct to ever fill the void or block the reality of an infinite source to be able to accomplish that. So what is drug addiction? Always need more. Why? It's avoiding the problem. And as a result, the problem grows. What do we try to do? Use more and more to stay ahead of the problem. Same thing pain medication does. The doctors talk about it. You got to get the medication ahead of the pain. If you get it behind the pain's going to win. So the point is you start taking it at the beginning of the pain as prescribed, it tends to nullify the pain. If you get behind the pain will tend to outrun it. So it won't work. I broke a tooth once and a doctor gave me nothing could be done to broke it in half. And it was the most pain I'd ever felt. And I got the pain medication 12 hours later. It didn't work at all. Nothing. Point is that addiction is about trying to outrun that pain, trying to stay ahead of it chronically. And the pain we create in our body is stress. Stress is normal to a degree. But when it becomes chronic, it turns the body into an abnormal use, which is diseased, unhealthy. So we create diseases to justify the thinking to say, see, life's difficult. Life's not difficult when we're the creators of something that undermines our metabolic and parasympathetic and all of the different systems that we have, the immune system and all that. When we undermine it with stress, chronic stress, Life isn't difficult. We've simply applied difficult principles that are unprincipled, difficult ideas to our thinking that stress our body because our body knows better and we know better as knowing beings. We absolutely know better. And we wouldn't be ashamed and guilty and feel disconnected and low self-esteem and low self-worth and self-abuse if we didn't know better. None of those, if we didn't know better and what we were doing is what we were doing, we'd just be doing what we're doing without any question or argument. Animals do not wear watches to figure out whether they're on time or late.
Yeah, that's lucky them.
Yeah, well, it shows, though, that the one thing we've been given that is unique, that separates us seemingly from the animals, is choice. We can choose to do things voluntarily. We can choose to think about our thinking. Animals don't tend to do that. They just think in alignment with what's happening and they act accordingly. And the story of human history talks about this conflict. Adam, killing his brother and telling God he doesn't know. God comes and says, "Where's your brother?" "I don't know. He killed him." And he's talking to God and he's telling God he doesn't know. Supposedly the first two kids on earth. True or not, it's been a story told for a long time, and the point of it's largely been overlooked.
Yeah.
So if we're there, there's no place to go to be there. There's no place to get. We've already got everything. And the thoughts that are imagined, and delusion is only delusional when an illusion is considered to be real and true. Just like a wrong thought is not a lie until it's thought to be right. Then it becomes a lie. And to any degree we entertain thoughts that are wrong and act as though they're right, and I would say culture largely defines this body of fixed beliefs and ideas, to the degree that we maintain those as being absolutely correct and right, or true and real, which are truth and reality have to be absolute or they wouldn't be true or real, we've created an internal conflict that is impossible to overcome as long as we maintain it. And the critical nature of the maintenance is to act in this hypnotic trance as though it's not something we're doing, and wondering why we become desensitized to what's happening around us and have things like ADD when all we're doing is paying attention to what isn't happening and wondering why we can't seem to pay attention to what is happening, and things that are happening keep going wrong. And we call them accidents and, oh, it's just life. And look at this. And it always happens to me, when we're creating it to give ourselves we're manifestors to create these things, to give ourselves perspective, to see exactly what we're doing, and we're denying it by using it that as an excuse to claim the problem is the problem, rather than seeing that the source of that problem is what we're doing in our thinking. Our whole capacity to use imagination in our favor and others is thwarted and undermined by that single breach.
What's the breach?
Thinking that what we think is an illusion becomes true and real, that becomes a delusion. It's a mirage. Exhausting all our energy to get to the oasis in the Sahara Desert because we're dying of heat and lack of water. And there's nothing there, and we exhaust every ounce of energy to get there and find out it's still sand and hot, and there's no water. It's a mirage. It's a hypnotic trance that we make believe is truth and real, so we can justify continuing, hoping someday it's right, so we can get over the guilt and shame, rather than concede guilt and shame is an accurate assessment of doing something we are guilty for and shameful of, period. We don't talk about it openly, so we foster these ideas that guilt and shame needs to be coddled and nursed, and people need to be helped out of it as though it's real, rather than seen as something we're creating that accurately assesses exactly what we're doing. And rather than read the sign as it's written, we see stop as go, and we race through the intersection and wonder why things end up crashing around us.
I think a lot of it, well, definitely for me, but I think human beings in general, we've talked about this, just that physical comfort that comes with sustaining the thoughts that we're used to. And, an old pair of shoes can be more comfortable than a new one.
Yes, and that same old pair of shoes can be comfortable because we've developed calluses to keep us from feeling where they don't fit,
Yeah,
right? It's
yeah, yeah.
typically where calluses come from on feet, are rubbing against something so long that we go numb to it. So the wrong is overlooked in the name of numbness, when numbness is desensitization, is actually a commitment to a lack of awareness and a willingness to make believe we're asleep and wonder why things turn into a nightmare.
There it is. That's the diagram. Problem solved.
Well, I mean, if we know it, we know it. My sense is, and I think we've seen it collectively when we meet on Sundays, when people are new, they struggle a little bit and then they start, something happens. They watch other people admit things they're doing and say, oh, yeah, I do that all the time. Not the same faces, not the same places, not the same way, but they recognize that the principle of what they're doing, the unprincipled nature, is the same. They're lying. They're thinking something's true that isn't true. And interesting, truth does not need thinking. Thinking is a possibility of truth. Truth is not a possibility of thought. But when we think in terms that aren't honest, we break down, suggesting that we know what truth is, or we wouldn't break down. Just like a car knows how to run with oil, and if it doesn't get it, it tends to break down. That isn't the fault of the car. That's the fault of the operator. We are the operator of these bodies.
I think of this. It's constant for me these days, especially since joining your group and meeting you and having this conversation. And I'm constantly recognizing the thoughts I try to put to things, the untruths that I try to create. And then I catch myself and I say, here you are, you're doing it. You're developing, you are installing these roadblocks based on what you think is true. That's what you're doing right now. And then there's that other voice that says, yeah, but what about this? Yeah, what about that? And it's a long list. And like, yeah, I don't know. Maybe this thinking is not right. Yeah, I do it all the time.
Think of yeah, but. Okay. And it's translated today. I'll give that commentary in a minute. Yeah means I agree, but means I don't agree.
I know.
Think of you see the conflict immediately. You know what people say now? Listen in the conversation. That's changed. They don't say yeah, but as much. Us guys who are a little more mature or immature, older, maybe do that. But you know what people say now? Listen, yeah, no. Yeah, no.
Yeah, I've noticed.
You hear it all the time.
They say it on all the time.
Yes. And why? They're admitting their internal conflict. They're trying to make nice on one hand and then challenge what's being said. They're trying to say yes, but no. Yes, but no. Yes, but no. Rationalization and justification never rationalizes and justifies truth and reality, because there's no need for rationalization and justification in something that doesn't change. So the formula of maintaining obsessive thoughts is always built in the stories. What are cultures? The stories of civilization. What is that? Generally, uncivilized stories that are used to create indignation. So self-indignation becomes the fight for the nation against others, thinking the best thing we can do is kill them because they're not thinking like we are. All based in thought. It's not reality and truth. The reality and truth is we're all built on the exact same platform. We may have different traits. We may be different heights and different shapes and sizes and all that, but the natural platform of life is exactly what we're built on. The whole embryonic process, all of the stuff that humans come from is identical. And yet we argue over the distinctions we have to make believe that we're more right than someone else, and use that contention to justify treatment that is subhuman, because we wouldn't tolerate it if we were doing it to ourselves. And yet by doing it to others, we are doing it to ourselves, denying that we're having anything to do with it, because it's the right thing. We're seeing it today at an ever-present rate. And what's interesting today is the fact that it's more obvious doesn't mean it's worse. It means my suspicion is we're getting ready to look at it accurately because we're beginning to allow it to be seen as it is rather than have it buried within the culture of normalcy that it's been hiding in or seemed to be hiding in while it was festering and growing the whole time. So like in our own lives, when you start feeling worse accurately, you're actually starting to feel thoughts that are worse than they could be. And so the feeling is a good indication of something you're thinking, and to see that in its accurate nature rather than as something to get away from. Because when you think of the feeling as independent of the thinking, you're thinking of the problem as the symptom. And so what are we treating with alcohol? All the 150 different 12-step programs are all based in symptomatic recovery. Drugs, alcohol, coke, meth, marijuana, anonymous, gambling, sex, all those things. And the root of it all is the same exact thing. I got this. I can control this. Don't worry, this time it'll be different. And it's the same thing we're doing in the thinking that if we do it long enough, it's going to get better. So I'm going to go home and isolate on it where there's no challenge to me. And I'm going to feel better about isolating it because no one's around to say, you know what? I think you're struggling. I think something's wrong. To say anything that might contrast with our own isolated, self-serving, self-imposed, self-induced sense of self and who we are. And that's all born in thought.
So you bring me back to my isolation. And when I'm there and I'm getting better at acknowledging where I am and what I'm doing, I know it's time to pick up the phone. I don't want to, and I know this is probably arrogant and it lacks humility. I don't want to burden somebody else with my bad energy.
That's a lie.
I know it is. Well, yeah, but it's a lie.
Just think about it. You don't want to admit the burden you're carrying, and you wouldn't be carrying the burden alone if you did. And this is one of the reasons people kill themselves, because they think the best thing they can do is not trouble anyone else. And the fact is, we are all in a form of communion, and communication is one of the most common uses of that. And our community within sobriety are like-minded people who have suffered equally and recovered. And all of a sudden, we have a reminder, as you just said, to pick up the phone and talk to somebody. And that simple act
too.
Yes, but
the shame that keeps me from doing. I don't want to share. I don't want to let you know that I'm not doing well.
But think of this. The shame is compounded by continuing that thought. Why? Because it's shameful. Why wouldn't it be? The thought is what is condemning, not talking to somebody. So what do? We twist it and think it's talking to them that's really bringing it up. It's the same with admitting this stuff openly. People say it's really hard for me. And I said, yeah, because it's been so hard for you living with it that you're ashamed to admit how hard it's been.
Do you know I can be shameful of my shame?
Yes. That's why it compounds. It's exactly what obsessive thought does. It makes the problem worse in the name of trying to solve it. So while the problem's getting worse, we have this vague impression that somehow it'll get better. And that's that term of applying the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. The result will always be the same. And we just keep doubling down. It's like if you gambled and had the money to double down, you'd always break even. But if you double a penny, I don't know if you've ever heard this in math. If you take a penny and double it every day for a month, it turns into about $11 million.
No, I didn't know that.
And so doubling down, most people can't afford to double down. Because if they go 6 or 8 or 12 hands, those numbers start to get well beyond what they originally came. Think of this too. People go to Las Vegas always with an amount of money they're willing to lose. I've never had somebody say, I'm only going to make 10 grand and then I'm leaving the table. Ever. They always go with an expectation of losing. So what do? They lose. And they say, oh, well, that's, I expected. I have a friend, he says $2,500 is my limit. He reaches it every time. But he's looking for that big pot. He's looking for the big pot of gold at the end of it that's 100,000 or 200,000 or a million that will finally make up for it all. And he may get it. But in thinking about something that's impossible, it's impossible for it ever to be true, because the impossibility of it is that it has no substance. The denominator is zero. It doesn't matter how big you make the numerator. It's nothing. Nothing. And we make believe it's everything. And we stake our lives on it, a human experience on it. And we kill our bodies early through the stress. We undermine them and say that we're afraid of death when we're actually creating it. It's a death wish. We're creating it and lying about it the same way you just thought you were ashamed to tell somebody else because of the admission, when in fact the real admission is that you're creating the problem by not doing it. The solution becomes the problem becomes the solution in addiction. And it all starts in thinking. We are twisted in our thinking to maintain those ideas and make believe somehow someday they'll come true. And it's just a matter of getting worse to prove it. It's crazy.
13 years of sobriety, and I'm still
34 for me, my friend.
Still dealing with that.
And I have friends who are 40 that still struggle with this, because my sense is, as a community, we're not talking about it openly and honestly as we can. And my sense is all of the principles are laid out in the big book. For anyone listening, there are programs that can help you deal with any symptomatic issue you're struggling with. And they will all track back to the thinking you're doing about that thing that causes this repetitious behavior to make believe somehow if you do it more, you'll get better. And because you feel better for a moment, you're getting better, when in fact the feeling again is being treated and not the thinking, because it's reinforcing the thinking as being the solution, because now you're using the problem of how you feel bad to justify wanting to feel better all the time. That is insanity.
And I'll just add, my life is on paper is not even on paper. My life is wonderful. After 13 years of sobriety has given me an abundant life. And, I'm trying to bring honesty to this conversation with regards to thinking, because I've been doing something right, because my life today compared to where I was before I got sober is just, I can't compare it. It is just, it's so far ahead of where I was, and healthier on every single level. And I do have an amazing life today. The unfortunate aspect of my life is that I don't recognize what I have. I'm worried about losing what I have.
Well, consider this, Matt.
Which is fucking crazy.
If where you are is the only place you can be, and everything that is with you in that place, and you think you're not there, wouldn't it be natural to think you would be afraid of losing everything, because your conscious thoughts are thinking where you are isn't where you are, and where you are isn't where everything is? Wouldn't that be a loss in thought of those things?
Yeah. And that's what I do.
What do we do? Capitalize on that to make believe it's the stuff we have we're afraid of losing, while in fact our own experience has given up the absolute nature of our existence and source of being on the basis of thinking that's completely insane. We simply don't accept. And I struggle with this, trust me. I get stuck in the consequences, and I like more of stuff I like more than I like more of stuff I don't like. So I'm often in the scramble. But if we already have everything, I'll tell you what I suspect we're witnessing. Our lives get better. Our lives get better. My life gets better. Your life gets better. And we're not seeing that the basis of that betterment is to allow us more latitude to consider all other lives synonymously, simultaneously, and immediately alongside ours, not just ours. That just becomes a new form of self-centered thinking, to think that because my life got better, look at me. And we say, there but for the grace of God go I. Think of that as though God's grace has failed them, but has given us something. And that would suggest God gives and takes what is infinite, which would be impossible. And it's just another story we tell to justify we're better than them and need to isolate from them and not participate with them and talking about things honestly enough, just like the kids. When kids hear honesty, I was with Katie's niece and she's 8 or 9 and reads voraciously. And she said something and I confronted her on it a little bit and she lit up and looked at me with these big eyes and just laughed. And I could hear that she gets phobic about things. And I could see that connection gave her much more confidence in me than she had ever had as an adult. Right? I don't remember exactly what it was, but the fact is the kids are intact and we're treating them as though they need to follow our direction. And our direction has not been healthy for a long time.
Yeah.
And they're good to be, they're smart to be suspect and skeptical. And my sense is what we have forgotten even within the context of AA, for instance, and or the other programs, is that those people that we see on the street struggling from drugs and alcohol are actually the exact same people that AA was created to go talk to. And unfortunately, the greater sickness is allowing the conditions to become so depraved and so diseased and so fraught with bacteria and health issues and fire and arson that goes on and violence that goes on and conditions that are not healthy and safe, that people have held back from even approaching and saying hello and doing what we could do and what we do amongst ourselves within the community that we've learned to carry our message and to carry the idea that there is a solution to others. And it isn't happening in that broad way because it isn't being spoken of, honestly, in my estimation.
Yeah, no, not mine.
So if we can consider it and simply stop the thoughts that are inconsiderate, the chance for a solution would automatically begin to evolve. And I suspect society is starting to look at things and seeing them for what they are now and realizing if the problem keeps getting worse, it's obviously a misdiagnosis of the problem. And to spend billions of dollars and think that the problem is that people need houses. I don't know anybody. I have known thousands of people in sobriety. I've worked with hundreds of people. I've spoken to thousands of them over the years. I don't know any of them who were given a condo to get sober. Not one. We have invited people from around the country and around the world to lavish themselves on the streets that are so sick that if any of us allowed those conditions on our private property, we would be charged with anywhere from child abuse to elder abuse and animal cruelty for letting dogs and cats live in those kind of conditions. And yet we're doing it in the name of compassion socially. That's a social ill that I would say perfectly reflects the same sort of decrepit, bankrupt ideas that I maintain when I think what is wrong is right, and promote those ideas. That's exactly the kind of thinking I did when I was a kid.
Yeah.
It's addiction. More of the wrong thing is the right thing. It's insane. So I don't think it's an accident. I think this is a reckoning of humanity to begin looking at society as a function of our collective thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a perfect manifestation of exactly what we're thinking. And to think that those people are helpless and hopeless is to admit the helplessness and hopelessness of the thinking we're doing in relation to them. It's obvious because nothing's hidden. There are no secrets. It's all available. What we do with it is a choice. And one of the choices is to choose to do the wrong thing as though it's right. And it simply sets off an interminable inner conflict and emotional turmoil that is evidence that something's wrong. And yet within addiction and this hypnotic state that we seem to end up in, we think doing it more will solve it.
So as a collective, as a society, we're applying addictive thinking to pretty much everything.
Solutions that are the problem, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this isn't about condemning anyone or talking about, because if we're doing it, we're all doing it. And if people are people, they're doing it in the same way we do it. They're just expressing it in different ways. But if it's dysfunctional, it's worth at least admitting. That if a problem gets worse, it probably isn't being treated properly. Just like if a math problem continues to seem complex, the principles of math are not being applied properly. It isn't math that's the problem. It's the person applying the principles that's the problem, or misapplying the principles. That's all that this comes down to. So the real question isn't so much how do we let go of what we're doing, but to begin to ask, how committed must I be to continue to think there's no way to let go of it? That's a sense of blind faith. That's a trance that the thing I'm doing is so real and true, there's no possibility. That's sickness when I'm creating it, not even admitting I'm doing what I'm doing, to allow the undoing to happen when I simply see it for what it is and allow it to be what it is, and I start laughing about it rather than crying over it. And collectively, my sense is we are designed to interact and communicate and cooperate so that we have the advantage of each other's perspective, so we can stop using people as excuses and blaming them for what we're feeling and start thanking them for the opportunity of using them to see what we're doing as perspective that gives us a little distance from the blindness of this seeming, we don't ever see our thoughts, but we sure know what we're thinking. And our eyeballs never see our eyeballs, but they certainly see what they're seeing. And yet we think sitting at home alone and thinking more alone is going to somehow clarify it, rather than notice in the communication we have and the potential of that communication. We're given broad awareness, whether we want to face it or not. If it becomes clear that we don't want to face it, at least we begin admitting we're the observer of what we're doing and deciding to continue to do what we've been doing that's wrong.
It's so easy for me to I'm getting everything you're saying. I deeply agree with it, but it's so easy to say we're fucked.
Well, but in terms of what we're doing with thought, we are just like we would be if we didn't put oil in a car. It isn't the car that's fucked and we aren't fucked. It's doing things that are fucked. Meaning I don't even know why we use that term, because typically that would be used as something that promotes birth and help, something.
Yeah.
It would spawn something, but we seem to use that term backwards.
Well, it also goes back to, it also takes me to, which I also agree with strongly, is to make a difference, to start to make a difference is to think globally and act locally. And what I get from how you present, how we can make a difference, is it's starting, we can't get any more local than ourselves.
Start to admit you've been making a difference the whole time. People say, I really want to make change. You say, everything's changing. All right, that's done. Now, what's next? It's never about making change, and it's never about making a difference. It's about admitting we're already making the difference, and we just don't like admitting the difference we're making. We're doing it now. The manifestation of things are a collective of how we are each thinking as a society, as a race. They are all perfect manifestations reflecting exactly the way we are thinking, the same way the stock market reflects all the thinking going on about a stock. That price represents everything that's going on in relation to that people who are making the decisions to buy or sell are thinking. And it's exactly the state of our present state is to admit it's a manifestation of exactly what I'm thinking and what you're thinking and what we're thinking collectively, not what I'm thinking alone, where I'm so damned I need to feel. Think of how grandiose it is to think that I would be responsible and nobody else. That's like vanity and pride. Think of that. I am so responsible that I can't stand it where everybody else is irresponsible, and I just wish I were them. We pillar ourselves on the value of what we're doing dysfunctionally to claim that we're so exceptional. It's something we can't even talk about, as though it's so shameful. We're so good at, we've been singled out from all the 7.5 billion people. It's preposterous. It's a complete lopsided view of what's happening, and it's irrational and unreasonable.
Yeah.
And crazy, I'll admit.
Definitely that.
And I don't talk about this because I don't do it. I talk about it because I want to get better at talking about it. That's it. That's why this is a discussion. And communication is about communion. It's about allowing that interactive, that conversing to take place, where ideas begin to become diffused rather than more sedentary and appear more solid by maintaining them in the isolation of our own thoughts. And self-centeredness is that idea that I even have a self centered in what I think. How solid is that if the things are always changing what I'm thinking about it? How much stability do I have in thought? I'm constantly out of balance. Why wouldn't I feel unstable,
Right.
out of control? When in fact, the control I'm offering is a lack of control, a complete random flurry of thoughts trying to maintain this isolation and this sense of centeredness, when in fact, as Stephen Hawking said, in an infinite universe, and I wouldn't say the universe is infinite, but if there's an infinite realm, everyone's at the center because there are no edges. There is no space. There is no dimension to it. And if everything were at the center, it suggests we're unified once again, and that communion is the nature of community and communication. It's our nature. We're just not talking about it accurately. And so we get apathetic. Why? Because the things we're thinking about have no value. Why wouldn't we be apathetic? It isn't some condition that's accidental. It's consequential to the lack of substance in the thinking we're doing and what we're talking about socially.
Yeah. And our access to what's going on socially. I mean, it doesn't help.
I would say it helps because we're finally looking at things that have been thought to not be there. And it's the same.
You don't think it's making things worse, though?
I think if you're looking at things accurately and they're worse and you assess them as worse, that's accurate. If we're seeing what's wrong, we've been given an opportunity to address it collectively as wrong. And we can see it as something that should be hidden, but that's just one more idea that we keep to ourselves, that we can hide what we're doing in the dark and think we're better off by denying it. And our body absorbs that toxic shock, and the intoxication of that is the undermining of all our bodily systems and the release of all kinds of chemicals for emergencies, because the body doesn't know what it's facing in an imagined emergency is any different than a regular emergency, except for one thing. The instinct that comes out of imagined emergencies has fight, flight, and freeze and fawn turn against the individual rather than help to save them. Normal fear of real threats has us act in ways that save us. All of those exact same things in mental threats that we impose on ourselves ends up killing us. They're all based on addiction. They're exactly the opposite. And our body knows better. We aren't reading the signs or the signals.
So if collectively we're thinking in an addictive way, we're applying addictive thinking, which means collectively we're addicts, which means how close are we to a bottom? I understand what you're saying. Yeah, there's more to look at and there's less to deny.
Well, and as you begin accepting and allowing and conceding that things are how they are, it takes the judgment out of it in terms of trying to come to a conclusion that's convenient, and begins to actually have us sentiently recognize our compassion and our awareness and our concern and our consideration and our want and hunger for things that would represent peace on earth. Rather than waiting till we die to be considered resting in peace, start to recognize that our natural being state of existence doesn't have to wait for our body to die. And that whole thought gives us a very clear impression that it's our body and what we're doing with it in terms of thought that's causing the lack of peace that we seem to only wait for death to bring. That's pretty crazy to live a whole life thinking that death brings peace. Well, it would suggest life is all about conflict, when in fact it's about interaction. And reaction is a fight to the death. It's a death wish, addictive thinking. As we're clearer in the conversation, the clarity of all that's happening, if it's worse, is absolutely correct when it's worse. If you're looking at something disturbed and you're not disturbed, you're psychotic. We are designed to be aware of what's happening, and we can make up anything we want because we're free to do that. But it doesn't make it true or real. And to live the way we have, making believe those thoughts are true and real, is to have the society we have today exactly as it is occurring. Exactly, precisely. So welcome to the world as we have asked for it to be. If we didn't want it, we wouldn't be doing it. And when want in diseased thinking wants what kills us, it's hard for us to admit we could possibly be culpable for that. So we go into that state of that hypnotic trance, seemingly, where we have our back turned and say, if it's behind me, I don't have eyes in the back of my head, so I don't see what's happening. So it must not be happening. And I don't have anything to do with it. Fact is, we all have everything to do with everything. We're here. If we weren't, we wouldn't have a place. If you feel displaced, it's not because you're displaced, because you wouldn't be able to feel displaced if you didn't have a place. You cannot be apart from something that you're not a part of. All these things we think are so silly, and they're simply impositions of thoughts. And the imposter of those impositions is ego, who I think I am. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. Simple, easy. We took on a role in a play, and we haven't wanted to get off the stage since we were 4.
Yeah.
We think we're King Lear or someone, Falstaff, whoever it might be, whatever the character is. And we think we're going to die if we let go of that thought, when in fact that thought is the thing killing us in terms of the physicality and the blindness and the impressions that are created that aren't real. But if we're so compelled to make believe they're real, imagine how easy it would to allow reality simply to be real and not have to be burdened by all the conflicts we create to continue to develop those sick thoughts. How productive would we be? Productive. How constructive would we be? Constructive. How functional would we be? Functional. All those possibilities, all the imaginations, all the things we struggle over that we do toxically in the world to satisfy our energy needs, for instance. There is nothing but energy in this universe. And all we figured out is ways to use it that creates toxins. That's a pretty good indication that we haven't been really utilizing what's there. It's there. If we think of it as something that's mysterious, we're going to make sure that we do mysterious things to justify the thinking. It's there and it's available. And it's just a function of thinking from a premise of absolute knowing rather than conflicted thoughts that aren't true. Intuition is about knowledge beyond reason, which suggests reason is absolutely useless to knowledge. And it isn't to say that our experience doesn't have value, but the value it has is contestable when applying it doesn't work. And reapplying it in the name of thinking it's the only thing we can do is a misapplication of our complete, absolute awareness.
Here, here.
Now. So what's interesting about that, here and now, isn't something that a present state of being that isn't bound in space and time is. It's what we experience of it in our body that is here now. It doesn't mean that thing is here now, because if it's not functioning in space and time, it doesn't function in distance and space. It just happens to be that we're aware of it where we are, so we call it here now, because where we always are is here, and where we are always witnessing and occurring and where anything is ever happening is now, always. There is no escape from that. We can think we can. We can think because we're not thinking about it, it's not there. We can think because our attention is compulsively thinking about something else, it's not there. But that would once again give thinking the basis of reality to even be able to obstruct something that is always exactly where we are. It's a lie. So, I love you, brother.
Love you too, Jack. Thank you for enlightening me once again.
You're already light in both forms of the term, but the thoughts we do are what give us the impression we're making, and the impressions we're making is the imposition of the imposter that we're making believe is who we are.
It's a calibration.
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah.
So
Well,
thank you
and
for that.
my sense though, Matt, for both the audience and you, is to recognize that as those things occur, it's not because of what I'm saying, it's because of what you know that the words align with and reveal. And it's the beginning of actually start to witnessing the awareness that you have naturally that isn't in contest at all. That only becomes in contest when you start thinking your thinking is something other than what you're doing, and thinking your conclusions become real and true. Thinking is something we do, like we have a body. It isn't who we are, it's just a body we have. We've been given charge over this body, literally. And when the charge we take of it is to impose it with charge to do things that are wrong in the name of what's right, we end up filling it with stress and stiffness and joint pain and all the kinds of stuff that restrict the blood flow and restrict the body from doing what it's doing to naturally heal. It's designed to maintain homeostasis, which is balance. And when I throw it out of balance from my own thinking, that imbalance is there to guide me, just like if I were walking on ground that all of a sudden shifted. It's telling me, move to another point. And when I deny it, I'm bound to slip and fall and hurt myself. And it's that simple. We just haven't seen this horizon as something we're creating, and we thought of it as something that was doomed, so we stayed away from it, just like mariners did when they thought the world was flat.
Yeah.
Just a paradigm of thought. Anyway, I love this conversation, literally, because my sense is the essence of life is love, and it's generous and giving and all-knowing and constantly available and accessible, and it also gives us the freedom to go wrong, which is what love does. Love doesn't say, only do what I want you to do. That's not love. Love says, do whatever you want. But as you do what you're doing, if you do it better, you'll start seeing that your full utilization and expression of this nature you have is found in the lack of conflict and the seamlessness of this awareness and the intuition that allows us to know exactly what to do, just like natural fear tells us to get our feet moving when there is a truck coming down the road and we didn't see it. We don't do a lot of thinking about that. I don't get depressed over my thinking in those moments. I just move. My feet tend to do what my feet are normally incapable of doing very quickly, because there's a sense of knowing, even in my body, that is metaphoric for this other greater sense of being, knowing that we all share.
Love it.
We'll continue. See you Sunday. Thank you for today. Thanks for coming a little bit earlier. Everyone who's listening, you are always welcome to email Matt. I can get an email to him. Anything that strikes that you may want to pursue in thought, we're happy to, I imagine we're happy to continue the discussion in any number of the alternate ways we have, telephone, email, etc. And we appreciate you listening, and we appreciate you being there. And we know, regardless of who your face is and what your name is, that if you're listening, you're there and you are with us and you're part of what we're discussing. You're not apart from it. You're intimately connected, as we all are. Love and peace.